Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. So today we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite movies from the 1970s, but first, a little bit of context. So I thank the universe pretty much every day that I was born at the time that I was, which was 1972, if you weren't aware. And I do that because kind of like my formative years, I guess, corresponded almost exactly with the explosion of punk and post-punk, still my favorite genres of music, the whole birth of MTV, the home video boom, and also the expansion of cable television into more houses. So yes, despite my dewy youthfulness, as you can see, I am, as the kids say, an old. And this should go without saying, but get off my lawn. Now, so cable TV, for all of you whippersnappers out there, wasn't really a thing, I feel like, until about the late 1970s. So I spent a lot of my very young childhood just kind of planted in front of one of those big, huge, giant faux wooden cabinet televisions, because it was a big thing in the 60s and 70s where they wanted the TV to look like a classy piece of furniture. So it was like this big fucking 500-pound shit that looked like a cabinet, you know what I mean? Also, the TV back then still had a dial that you had to turn to change the channels, of which when I was a kid, there were 3. Actually 4 if you count PBS, which was like your local station. Later on, like when I was a little bit older, we got another channel, Fox, which was channel 35 on the dial in my area, which was like a super big deal. But back in the day when it first started, it was kind of like a novelty because it's like, ooh, a 5th channel. Wow, it's like, aren't we fancy? Pretty much all they showed, because it was, pretty cheap when it started out, was like Hanna-Barbera cartoons and like old Sanford and Son reruns and stuff like that. But then when I was about 9 years old, I feel like right around that time, my dad started working for our local cable company, which back then was called Cablevision. And one of the perks of his job was that he got all the cable channels for free, including all of the new like pay movie channels like HBO and Cinemax. Like we didn't have all the ones they have now, like Stars and all that kind of stuff, but I think like HBO and Cinemax were kind of like the main ones. So yeah, now we no longer had the dial. I mean, the dial was still there on the TV, obviously, but you didn't use that. Now there was like this big beige box that kind of had this really, really crappy like wood veneer on it, and it sat on top of the TV and lit up, and it was like a big thing. Like I said, it was super fancy. It also had a slider that you used to like change the channel. I know this is like with young people nowadays are like, what the fuck are you even talking about? Yeah, I sound like I'm talking about like fucking horseless carriages or something. It kind of seems like that to me too, you know what I mean? Which is like, it's funny to like think back on like how weird it was. But yeah, so it had a slider to change the channel. And I remember being so excited because there were just so many channels. I just couldn't get over. I was like, oh my God, so many. And I think like those slider boxes, I kind of want to say it was either 48. It had 48 numbers on it or 72. I can't remember. It was one of those things. I think it was just 48, but that seemed like a lot because like I said, I grew up with only like 3 or 4 channels. So having 48 was like a big, it's like, how can you even like watch all of that stuff, nowadays? So I really only went into that brief little history lesson there to say that a large portion of the memorable movie experiences from my youth, from my childhood, came about because of those magical commercial-free movie channels that we were actually lucky enough to have. A lot of people didn't have them. Had we had to pay for them, we wouldn't have had them because, we didn't really have the money. We couldn't really afford it. But since my dad worked for Cablevision, we got them for free. So it's like we were lucky enough to have them. We got MTV like right when it first started as well. Since HBO and Cinemax were kind of, I feel like they were still fairly new and untested at that point, they tended to show kind of older, maybe more B-grade or sort of forgotten films, and they would often rotate them like out several times a day because they didn't have that many. And, things like that explains how I managed to see the wincingly terrible Christy McNichol musical, The Pirate Movie, which is actually like based on Pirates of Penzance. I saw that movie roughly 400,000 times, like before I hit puberty, because they just played it all the time. And for whatever reason, I was a kid and I was home from school or whatever, and I was just like, oh, it's on, I'll watch it again, whatever. You know what I mean? Grease 2, kind of the same. That was like a little bit later on. But I mean, they did show like a lot of like shitty, forgettable movies, but I don't want to like go too far in that direction because they did actually show like a lot of really, really great movies too. Like, Foul Play with Chevy Chase and Goldie Hawn, which was fantastic. I saw that a bunch of times. Burgess Meredith was in that as well. So movies like that, they did show a lot of good ones. And one of the great ones, one of my favorite ones, is our movie that we're talking about today. Now, it's not technically a horror film. It does have horror aspects to it, but that said, I'm not really sure what you'd classify it as. I kind of feel like it's maybe a science fiction thriller. Like it has, like I said, horror elements. It has comedy elements. It's just kind of one of those movies that you really kind of defies genre in like the best possible way. And regardless of what genre it is, it's still like a perennial favorite of mine. I would still happily watch it right now if you asked me to. I've seen it millions of times. I probably have it memorized at this point, but it's just so good and I just never get tired of it. So this movie came out in 1979, although I didn't see it until probably like a year or two later. And it's called Time After Time. Now, it was directed by Nicholas Meyer. And the premise behind this movie was fucking genius. I still think it's fucking genius. So what it is you have the real life writer, H.G. Wells, who is played by Malcolm McDowell, who I love. He's not content with simply scribbling about time machines in his fictional works. He's actually built one that's legit, like it actually travels through time. And so he invites like a bunch of his upper class twit friends like over to his house back in the 1890s to show them, to demonstrate it for them. Now, of course, they don't believe him and just thinks they think he's gone off the deep end or whatever. But in the middle of this little thing where they're kind of like making fun of him and stuff like that, a cop shows up at H.G. Wells's house and says, oh, hey, Jack the Ripper has killed again. Now, this actually takes place in 1893, I think, which, if you know your Ripper lore, which I kind of feel like a lot of you guys do, Jack the Ripper's murders took place in like 1888. So this is actually positing that Jack the Ripper took like, a several year hiatus and then came, which is not crazy. I mean, that's not crazy to think that. And then like came back later on and started doing the thing. So the constable shows up and says, hey, Jack the Ripper has killed again, and all the clues have led him right back to this house. And he's like, yeah, I was having a party here tonight. And it turns out, like, they searched the house, and it turns out that one of H.G. Wells's guests and one of his closest friends, who's a guy named John Leslie Stevenson, who's played by the always great David Warner, who I think sadly passed away recently. He's left behind a medical bag that has like all these bloody gloves in it. So police are like, well, we've got your Ripper, there he is. And so they search for him everywhere in the house, but if you know anything about movies, you know where that slippery serial killer has gone. That's right. He's gone right down into the basement and hopped right into H.G. Wells' legit, really working time machine and has boogie right into the future to escape justice. Now, the only mistake that he made, and this is kind of like a plot thing that they, to explain like how the time machine ends up in certain places. So the time machine has like what Wells calls, I think he calls it a non-return key. So basically, like if you don't have that, you can still use the time machine, but the time machine itself, like you'll get out and fart around in the future or whatever, and then the time machine will come back without you. Like it'll come back to wherever the key is. So it does that automatically if you don't have the key. If you have the key, then you can leave it, it'll stay where you are. So because it comes back, and Wells is like, oh, that motherfucker, like he went into the future to, escape justice for being a serial killer. So the machine comes back and H.G. Wells is able to travel into the future to chase him because he feels responsible for him escaping. Now, much to his confusion, H.G. Wells ends up in San Francisco in 1979, not in London as he was expecting, because obviously that's where he took off from, you know what I mean? But it turns out that in 1979, the machine that he built is actually part of a museum installation in San Francisco about his life. So this is kind of where the more funny it's almost kind of like a romantic comedy too. It has aspects of like all different genres, but like I said, it totally all works together. So he climbs out of this roped off machine, and obviously, like, you know, and he's very like dignified in all of his like Victorian regalia or whatever. And you know, everybody's looking at him. Of course, he gets yelled at, like, "Hey, what are you doing back there? Like, get on the other side of the ropes or whatever." So from there, he kind of sets off in pursuit of Jack the Ripper. So as I said, at this point, it's almost kind of like, it's not zany, you know what I mean? Like, maybe it sounds zany what I'm saying, but it's definitely like a fish out of water comedy, like for the first part of it, because H.G. Wells turns up in 1979, and so there are some kind of like amusing scenes as you see H.G. Wells trying to figure out like what the hell is the deal with this 20th century thing. And it was 1979, so it was still kind of like disco was still a thing, and like, so you saw people walking around with like saran wrap pants and shit like that, and he's just like, all right, whatever. Which I kind of feel like that would happen nowadays too, if you walked around with saran wrap pants. Like, most like people would just be like, okay, yeah, but everybody didn't dress like that back then, though. But yeah, he was just kind of like looking around being like, what the fuck? This isn't as zany as it maybe could have been, because Malcolm McDowell is just so good in this. Like, he's so dignified and brings like such a gravitas and like a grace to the role that you mostly kind of like, you kind of laugh because it's like, oh, you know, funny that he doesn't really know like what you know, what plastic is. Well, he does know what plastic is, but it's just kind of like he goes in McDonald's and he like freaks out over the French fries and the material the table is made of and stuff like that. He's like, this isn't wood, like, you know what I mean? So it's that kind of stuff, but you mostly just kind of sympathize with him. You don't just be like, oh, idiot, whatever. It's not like that, but he's just like really, really good in it. Now, he eventually does find Jack the Ripper, of course, otherwise there would be no movie, but along the way, he also finds love. Like I said, this is kind of like a romantic comedy, too. Now, H.G. Wells, who is a smart fella, he realizes that his friend, Jack the Ripper, John Leslie Stevenson, that's what he knows him as, will need to exchange his super old money for modern American currency to be able to operate at will in this new society. So he starts asking around at all the foreign exchange currency desks of all the nearby banks, you know, basically like, hey, was there another old-fashioned looking dude with Victorian looking money and Victorian looking duds like I have on? You know, has he been in here recently? Now, as luck would have it, the woman managing the desk where Jack changed his money is the quite gorgeous and delightfully forthright Amy Robbins, who's played by Mary Steenburgen. Is it Steenburgen or Steenburgen? I feel like I always say it different. It's like I should probably check one of these days. Now, interestingly, I think it's Mary Steenburgen, actually. She actually married Malcolm McDowell, like the year after this movie came out. I think they met like on the set of this. They sadly divorced in 1989, but I like to think that they're like still together in my headcanon, you know what I mean? So Amy meets him, and she is all about Wells's like vintage duds, very kick-ass. He looks like all fucking super cool and everything. Also, he has kind of like a foxy, like upper crust British accent. She loves that. And he has like really, really gentlemanly manners. And her being it's 1979 and it was, you know, that was like a very women's lib thing to do. So she's just, you know, she's all up into that too. So she just straight up asks him out. You know what I mean? So Wells is kind of like taken aback by this, but pleasantly so, because I do kind of like that they feed into like H.G. Wells was kind of like, you know, he was a sci-fi writer and stuff like that, but he was also like very liberal, very progressive for his time. So he was like a very early advocate of women's rights. So probably if he came into 1979 and a woman asked him out, he'd probably be surprised, but he'd be like, oh, cool. You know what I mean? So he was kind of like into free love and shit too. So basically he handles the whole situation with, you know, remarkable aplomb, you know, considering that he just traveled into the future from a century before, and the two of them kind of like, you know, start falling in love or whatever. Now, HG tells Amy that the man he's looking for is a murderer, but obviously does not tell her that they've both come from the past. Probably a wise decision. However, as the story goes on, you know, as you knew would probably happen, Amy actually becomes a target of the Ripper, and HG has to spill the truth to her in order to save her life. Now, obviously, she doesn't believe him at first, because who would? But he basically, like, proves it to her by taking her to the museum, putting her in the time machine, and, like, taking her 3 days into the future, like, to prove that it works. And when they get there, they find a newspaper in the museum that has Amy's murder on the front page, and she starts flipping out, as you would. Now, there are a lot of, tense moments as time goes on, like a whole bunch of women, mostly sex workers, kind of fall under the Ripper's knife as he's just like, woo, it's the modern day. I'm going to like go nuts. You know what I mean? So he starts doing that. But in the end, it actually does end up, I'll get into this in a minute, but it does end up like with a happy ending, sort of. HG essentially like sends Jack the Ripper into oblivion by essentially dissolving his atoms in the time machine, which you can do, which they do actually establish at some point, which is kind of neat because now that I'm thinking about it, it very neatly explains why Jack the Ripper was never caught, because H.G. Wells obliterated him inside his machine and like sent him into like another dimension or something like that. So they never caught him and they never found him, and that's why. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Also, the very thoroughly modern Amy decides that she loves Wells so much that she wants to go back to 1893 with him, which actually, like, I don't know. I do kind of like that. I don't know if she would have necessarily done that in real life. Like, not like this could happen in real life, but I'm just saying, but in the context of the story, it totally did work out. So all that aside, let me talk about my very, very favorite scene in this movie, which is like sort of kind of toward the end. And as I said, this is kind of after it's gone more in like a thriller horror type of direction. That's what's so interesting about this movie. And I guess I never really thought about it when I was watching it because I wasn't really worried about, it's one genre or another, but it has kind of like just ingredients from all different things. Like I said, it's kind of funny. It's kind of like a romance. It's a thriller. It's kind of sci-fi. And also it's definitely a horror movie because there's gore and like the serial killer and shit like that in it too. So, but I think it's like balances all of those ingredients like really, really well into like this, delicious stew of a movie. And it's just really, really good. And you don't see, I don't know if I want to say that you don't see that a lot nowadays, like kind of cross genre movie, because you still do, but I don't know if you see ones that are this like organic, I guess, like where everything just kind of goes together and you don't really question it, like what kind of movie is this, like you don't really worry about it like when you're watching it. I don't know, I'm kind of having a hard time like articulating what it is. So this is my very favorite scene, and one that actually like creeped me out quite a bit, like the first 100 times that I saw it. So as I mentioned earlier, HG and Amy actually know the day and the approximate time of when Amy's going to get murdered because they traveled a few days into the future and saw, her murder in the newspaper. So basically at first they're like, okay, well, you just don't be here. Like, we're going to change the future. So it's like, don't be in your apartment. Like when the Ripper turns up to kill you, and everything will be fine. Like things will work out different. But various things conspire to prevent this from happening, like for her like leaving her apartment. So what ends up happening is that Amy and HG had actually been up the entire night before, trying and failing to prevent the murder that took place before Amy's, like of a sex worker. So the following morning, which is a Friday, it's 10:30 a.m. and HG says, I gotta go somewhere, like, briefly. He's actually going against his very pacifist principles, and he's going to a pawn shop to buy a gun to defend Amy, although he doesn't tell her this, obviously. But he basically says, look, if I'm not back in an hour, then you should register at the Huntington Hotel, and I'll meet you there, and then we'll see where we're gonna go from there. Now, Amy is like kind of freaked out because she, the night before, had seen the Ripper's fourth victim being dredged from the canal, so she's having a hard time with it, and she's like, oh shit, that's like my fate too. So she perhaps unwisely decides to take a sedative and also takes a couple sips from HG's flask. Because she just needs to relax her nerves and she needs to sleep. And they're like, well, we have hours until the Ripper shows up, so it should be fine. And she's like, look, and HG's like, look, I'm just going to pop out for a few minutes and then, I'll be back in plenty of time to like wake you up, so don't worry about it. But as he's returning to his apartment, he gets picked up by the cops. And they find the gun that he just purchased in his pocket, and we'll get into why they picked him up in a second. But so they haul him off, like, while he's screaming up at Amy's window, but she's all zonked out. She doesn't hear him, and she actually ends up not waking up until like an hour before she's supposed to get murdered. So HG gets taken to the police station, and he's obviously interrogated about the killings because C, it turns out that police find it a little bit suspicious when you appear out of nowhere wearing weird-ass looking clothes with no ID, calling yourself Sherlock Holmes, thinking nobody in the future will get this reference, and also claim to know where the killer who's suddenly plaguing the city is going to strike next. Like I said, that's a little bit suspicious. So HG pretty much tries everything he can think of to get the police to listen to the truth. And it's just such a great, like, tense scene because he's just getting sweatier and more desperate, and he keeps, like, looking up at the clock, like, because he knows that, like, the time of the murder is coming and everything like that. Now, obviously, the investigator doesn't believe the whole time machine thing because HG, like, doesn't really try to lie. He's just like, look, I know this is going to sound crazy, but... you know, blah, blah, blah. And he tells him about it, and the investigator's like, yeah, no, not buying it, sorry. So the investigator just keeps, like, hammering at him, just, like, to admit that he's the killer. HG, though, he's, you know, a man of honor. He sticks to his guns, and he just repeats over and over, look, I've told you before, I'm from the past. Jack the Ripper, like, escaped here in my time machine. I'm after him, blah, blah, blah. And a woman's going to be murdered at Amy's address. Would you please just send a car over there for the love of God? You know what I mean? It's like, I swear to God, what I'm saying is the truth. I know it's insane. And at one point, he even gets, like, super desperate and, like, confesses to the murders. Like, I killed them all. You know what I mean? Just trying to get them to, like, do what he wants them to do. I mean, he's begging, he's pleading, he's freaking out. Nothing he does, like, seems to convince them. And then finally, at last, he looks at the clock and sees that the time of Amy's murder has passed. So at that point, he knows it's over. There's nothing else he can do. And he just kind of slumps down in his chair, and his eyes are all full of tears and stuff like that. And it's super, super sad. And he's just like, please just send a car. And he tells him her address, and he's just like, just send a car and I'll sign anything you want. Like, I'll sign a confession. So the detective guy, who's actually, like, pretty moved by HG's sincerity and, you know, also probably hoping to get a confession to all these crimes, is like, okay, fine. If you'll sign a confession, we'll send 2 guys over to Amy's place to see what's what. So the officers get there and they find her door ajar. And then they look inside, and one of them actually, like, turns his head and, like, throws up, because the inside of the apartment, and like I said, this is why, you know, this has horror movie elements. The inside of the apartment is just, like, splattered with blood. It's just, like, everywhere. And then they're laying on the carpet, you know, amid signs of, like, this big epic struggle that happened in there, is, like, a woman's severed hand, which, ooh, that, like, freaked me out so much when I was a little kid, because I was like, oh my God, but I think I've mentioned, like, on some of these videos before, that any kind of dismemberment, particularly beheading, but not always, any kind of, like, dismemberment, like, always kind of, like, freaked me out. Because the whole idea of, like, a piece of your body, like, being attached to you and then, like, no longer being attached to you, that, like, kind of freaked me out, especially when I was a kid. So then, like, in the next shot, the somber and slightly sheepish, it must be said, police inspector is telling HG, yes, the murder went down just as you predicted, and says, you know, I'm really, really sorry, and says, but you're free to go. So, you know, silver lining there. So HG, obviously, completely grief-stricken. You know, how did it end up like this? They had a plan. They were going to prevent the murder. All of a sudden, he couldn't even do it, and, you know, it is, like, super, super sad. So he starts, like, wandering through the dark, empty back streets of San Francisco, and he walks through a park. But yeah, like I said, this part is just so heartbreaking because, you know, Malcolm McDowell is just so great in this and just imbues the character with such, like, you just, like, really empathize with the guy. And I want to get into it a little bit too, because the chemistry between him and Mary Steenburgen is, like, really good, and that really kind of sells it too, that he's just really fucking crushed by this thing that has happened. And so he's walking through the park, there's nobody else around, and the only sound is, like, just these echoing footsteps, you know what I mean, of his footsteps as he's walking through this park. And then there's, like, another sound, and it's just this really eerie chime of Jack the Ripper's pocket watch, which you've heard a couple of times, like, in the movie previously. And then there's, like, a great scene where you hear Amy's, like, ghostly voice, like, Herbert, because that's his first name. His name's not HG. That's not what she calls him. And it's, like, super spooky. So, like, HG, like, spins around and he sees Amy, like, standing over there by the wall. And obviously, like, at first he thinks it's a ghost because she looks kind of, like, really pale and shit like that. Or, you know, maybe it's a figment of his imagination, but he's just like, holy shit, like, because obviously they thought she was dead, you know? But no, it turns out that Amy is somehow alive. And then she says, no, he killed Carol, my friend from work. I forgot I invited her over for dinner to meet you. And then, like, you as the viewer remember that, oh yeah, like way back at the beginning of the movie, like shortly after she met HG, she asked her coworker over on Friday night, and like I kind of feel like most viewers have probably like forgotten about that, but happily the screenwriter did not. So that actually did like pay off later on. So her friend from work, like her coworker, got killed instead of her. And then there's this great close-up of her very, very pale, like terrified face, and she just says, she goes, "The newspaper was wrong." Like the way she said it, it's like I didn't do it justice, but it's just like the way she says it is like super, super creepy. And I don't know why. I think I got into it before too, like people's voices like in certain registers like creeped me out to a degree, and just the way she says the newspaper was wrong like always freaked me out, like it gave me goosebumps. So then like Jack the Ripper, like obviously David Warner, like he comes from behind the wall and he's holding a knife to her throat, and he's basically like, well, I'm gonna kill her unless you give me the non-return key. And then from then on, like the story builds to its final climax. Like I said, HG does end up getting the better of Jack the Ripper and like sending him into another dimension, like from the time machine and everything like that. So he does kind of win. Now, like I mentioned, I can't tell you how much I adore this movie. It played approximately 5 times a day on one or another of the movie channels, and every single time, it was one of those movies where, like, if you were flipping through the channels and you saw that it was on, like, at no matter, like, what point of the movie it was, you would just sit there and watch it again, because what the hell else did you have to do? Nothing, that's what. And I brought this up earlier and I think this is one of the things, I mean, among the many things that, you know, make the movie like so iconic and so worth watching, is that the chemistry between Malcolm McDowell and Mary Steenburgen is like electric. I mean, it was actually I didn't know, like when I was watching it, I didn't know until many years later that they had actually married, like not too long after the movie came out. But once I learned that, I was like, oh, well, that makes total sense, because it almost seemed like the characters in the movie were like falling in love for real, like while the actors were actually like falling in love in real life. And it was just kind of like, so you could really, really see it more than pretty much. It's really like the only example that I can think of like that, where, you know, and maybe there's other ones that I'm not really thinking of, but it was just really, really obvious. You know what I mean? Like the chemistry between them was just like bam, like that, and you could really, really see it. And I mean, on top of that, I just love the whole story. Like the overall premise is so great, so genius. I still think that the gore is actually great. It's not super excessive, but there is, you know, some blood. It's a serial killer. I liked the whole fish out of water element of H.G. Wells, who is like a little bit, he's a good guy, but he's like a little bit prissy. So he's like a little bit out of his element, and he's kind of like harumphing around like 1979. But I like too that they made him like kind of cool. You know what I mean? Because the real H.G. Wells was kind of like I said, he was kind of more into, like, he was a more like progressive person. He was like, you know, believed in like there would be a utopia in the future and everybody would get along. So he was a lot more chill with stuff than maybe some other people would have been. I also got to say too that David Warner, and I love David Warner in pretty much everything, but he made a great Jack the Ripper. I mean, I think he made like one of the best like screen Jack the Rippers, if not the best one. I mean, he was just very cold, very calculating, very ruthless, but he was also like still really alluring and almost kind of sexy in a way, but in a really dangerous way. You know what I mean? It's kind of like hard to explain. I mean, he said stuff like, one of his best lines in this is he says to Wells, like they're talking, and he says, 90 years ago, I was a freak. Now I'm an amateur. Like he's showing him like all of the atrocities like on TV, like all the news, and it's like, you know, all the shit that was going on, like, you know, war footage and all this other kind of stuff. And he's just like, yeah, I was just kind of like this one little piddly serial killer like back then, but now look at what the fuck they've done. You know what I mean? I also really like it's very chess-like, the pitting of the kind of like overly idealistic and morally upright Wells. Like I said, he's a good guy, but his flaw was that he was too idealistic, too utopian. He thought that the future was going to be better instead of, you know, realizing that humans were always going to human. You know what I mean? So he kind of like contrasts nicely with the brutally realistic Ripper, who is obviously the bad guy, but he also understands that the utopia that H.G. Wells thought that he would find in the future was never going to be anything but a pipe dream. So he does understand that. And I kind of feel like this gave the movie a little bit of a depth and a little bit of an edge, because even though Wells wins in the end by defeating the Ripper and saving Amy, he also had his illusions of, human progress or a future utopia shattered, and kind of realized that even though Jack the Ripper was obviously an evil motherfucker, he was actually right about some things too, that like humans were always gonna be that way and that you couldn't really like get that out of them. You know what I mean? So in the end, like, H.G. Wells has another great line, or Malcolm McDowell as H.G. Wells has a great line in the end of this too, which is almost kind of like the central message of the movie, where he says every age is the same. It's only love that makes any of them bearable. That's like the lesson that he learned from it. But I mean, it's such a great film. And if you haven't seen it, I really do think it's one of the best time travel. It's certainly probably my favorite time travel, maybe other than Back to the Future. But that's kind of like I don't know, because Back to the Future isn't really a horror movie. This isn't a horror movie either, but it's definitely more a horror movie than Back to the Future is, that's for sure. But like I said, I don't know, it crosses genres in such a brilliant way. And I feel like a lot of people that grew up the same time as me have seen it, because like I said, it was hard to avoid it because it was on the pay channels all the time. But maybe it's one of those ones that for younger viewers have maybe kind of like slipped under the radar a little bit. And I feel like more people need to see it because it's just really good. The acting is good. The premise is great. I just really, really love this movie, in case you couldn't tell. And I really think that more people should see it. And what else can I tell you? It's like, please see Time After Time. It's amazing, and I love it. Now, let me know what you think about it in the comments. Have you seen it? Have you not seen it? Do you love it? Do you hate it? I don't think anybody hates it, but if you do, I'm sure there's some of you out there, but let me know. And that'll do it for this installment. Thank you for hanging out with me at the salon, and remember to like and share the video if you like this content. Subscribe to Scare Salon if you haven't already, and you can also go over to scaresalon.com, where I post more written content like book reviews and movie reviews and things like that you can read and entertain yourself. And I will see you again on the next one. Bye.